The wind howled across the dead, cracked surface of planet Tarsus 9. It was a forgotten world, left behind after the war between humans and the Zarnak aliens. Nothing lived here anymore, at least nothing that should. Only broken metal, burnt soil, and quiet ghosts of old battles. Sergeant Dax Monroe was alone. He lived in a small military bunker built half underground. It was cold, it was quiet, and it was supposed to be safe. Every day, Dax followed the same routine. Wake up, check equipment, scan the area, eat, record logs, sleep. It had been like this for nearly 2 months now. The command had sent him to monitor the old battlefield and collect data on the planet's condition. Just 1 more month, and he'd be shipped back home. He thought the mission would be boring, easy. But then his food started disappearing. It began with something small, a missing protein bar. Then 2, a bite out of a ration pack. At first, Dax thought maybe he had forgotten or misplaced things. Maybe he was just tired. The desert heat did strange things to the brain. But it kept happening. One morning, Dax opened his supply crate and froze. His sealed bag of meal packs was open. 1 whole package was gone, and the rest looked like someone had chewed through the corners. Chewed, not cut, not torn by tools. That wasn't normal. He walked around the bunker with his pulse rifle, scanning for life signs. The computer showed nothing. No human, no Zarnak, no wild creatures. Tarsus 9 was supposed to be dead. That night, Dax couldn't sleep. The next day, he set up a motion detector near the food locker. He placed a few fake ration packs on top, old ones he didn't mind losing. Then he turned off the lights, laid back in his bed, and waited in the dark. The first 2 hours were silent. Then, around midnight, something beeped softly. The motion sensor had triggered. Dax rolled off his bed without a sound, grabbed his rifle, and crept toward the food area. The small hallway flickered under the red emergency lights. His heart pounded in his ears. He turned the corner slowly. There, crouched in front of the open food crate, was a small figure. Tiny, thin. Its back was to him. It had long arms, skinny legs, and pale bluish skin with dark markings down its spine. Dax froze. It wasn't human. The creature stuffed a protein bar into its mouth, chewing fast, almost desperately. It didn't notice him, until he stepped forward and the floor creaked. The figure spun around. Big, glowing blue eyes stared up at him. The small alien's face was covered in dirt and fear. Its mouth trembled. It dropped the half-eaten bar and backed into the corner, hugging its knees. Dax raised his rifle, hands shaking. "Don't move," he said. The alien didn't understand. Instead, it let out a sound, not a word, but a soft, desperate whimper. It sounded almost like a child. It was breathing hard, staring at Dax like he was about to kill it, which, by every military rule, he was supposed to do. But something stopped him. Dax lowered the rifle a little. The creature's eyes blinked. Its lips parted. Then it said a single word, broken, soft, and full of pain. "Mama." Dax's heart cracked. He didn't know what to say. He had fought aliens before. He had seen Zarnak soldiers crush cities and humans blast them to dust. But this wasn't a soldier. This was a child. He looked no older than 5 or 6 in human years. Thin arms, dirty hands, ribs showing under his rough, torn clothes. And those eyes, wide, watery, terrified. Dax slowly placed the rifle on the floor. "It's okay," he said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you." The alien child didn't move, but he stopped shaking. Dax sat down on the cold floor, leaving a few feet of space between them. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean protein bar. He slid it across the floor. The child looked at the food, then at Dax. Cautiously, he picked it up and began to eat. He didn't say thank you. He didn't speak at all, but the way he ate, so fast, like he hadn't had a meal in days, told Dax everything he needed to know. This boy was starving. Dax stayed quiet and just watched him. After a few minutes, the child leaned against the wall, holding the wrapper like it was the most precious thing in the galaxy. The room stayed silent. After some time, the child closed his eyes and fell asleep right there on the floor. Dax didn't move. He sat beside his rifle, staring at the sleeping figure, thoughts racing. Where had this child come from? Was he one of the Zarnak survivors? Did he escape from an old battle site? Was his mother alive? He didn't know. All he knew was that tomorrow, everything would change. And he couldn't tell Command. Not yet. Not until he understood who this child was and where he came from. Because deep down, something in Dax whispered that this wasn't just a lost alien child. This was something bigger, something broken, and somehow it had found him. The sun rose slowly over the red wasteland of Tarsus 9, casting long shadows across the desert hills and wrecked machines buried in sand. Inside the old bunker, the air was dry and still, and the only sound was the soft breathing of the small alien child curled up on the floor beside a stack of food crates. Dax Monroe had not slept. He sat in a chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the child for hours. His thoughts went in circles. He had a direct order: observe, report, and stay out of contact with anything alive. And yet, right in front of him, a child from the enemy species was using his storage room as a hiding place, and he was feeding it. Dax rubbed his tired face. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered to himself. The child stirred. Its eyes opened slowly, still glowing that strange blue. It looked around like it had forgotten where it was. Then it saw Dax and froze again, just like last night. But this time, the fear wasn't as strong. Dax picked up a bottle of water and placed it gently on the floor, then pushed it toward the child with his foot. "Drink," he said quietly. The child blinked. Then, slowly, he reached forward with long, thin fingers and took the bottle. He sniffed it first, then drank with both hands like it was the first water he'd had in days. Dax watched him closely. There was something strange about the boy's movements. He was quick, but not wild. Scared, but not stupid. He was weak, yes, but not helpless. And he was watching Dax too. Not like an animal, more like someone trying to understand. When the boy finished drinking, he looked at Dax and said a word in his own language. Soft, foreign, musical. Dax didn't understand it. He pointed to himself. "Dax," he said slowly. The boy tilted his head, repeating it in a quiet voice. "Dax." Dax smiled just a little. "Yeah, close enough." The boy touched his chest, then tapped the floor with one finger. He looked unsure, then whispered something again. "Riku," he said. Dax nodded. "Riku, that your name?" The boy didn't answer, but something in his eyes said yes. They sat in silence for a while. Dax gave Riku another bar to eat. He didn't want to ask too much too soon. The kid had clearly been through something terrible, and the last thing he wanted was to scare him off again. Later that afternoon, while Riku slept again, Dax sat at his desk and opened the base terminal. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. There were 3 options. Report an unidentified alien contact. Call for backup and containment. Say nothing. He closed the terminal without typing a word. Instead, he walked to the storage closet, grabbed an old blanket, and gently laid it over Riku. The child stirred but didn't wake. That night, Dax found himself staring at the cracked ceiling above his bed, thinking of Earth. He thought of his little brother back home, how he used to get scared of the dark and crawl into Dax's room without saying a word. Just like this. He thought of the war. He thought of the dead. And he thought of how this boy, this alien child, somehow didn't feel like the enemy anymore. The next day, Dax took a risk. He led Riku to the back of the bunker where the old storage room had been turned into a tool area. He sat on the ground with a few pieces of paper and some markers. Riku watched, unsure. Dax drew a picture, a stick figure of himself. Then he pointed. Dax. Then he drew Riku. The blue skin, the glowing eyes. He pointed again. Riku. Riku nodded. Then Dax drew a picture of the planet. He sketched a hill, some old ships, the sun. Then he handed Riku the marker. The child looked at it, then sat down and began to draw. His hands moved carefully, like he'd done this before. He drew something shaped like a tall figure, a woman. Then a small figure, himself. Then fire, a broken ship, and finally, a dark cave. Dax leaned closer, trying to understand. That's your mother, isn't it? He said quietly. Riku didn't answer. He just looked down. Dax could feel the weight in his chest. So that was it. The kid had survived some kind of crash. Maybe a ship hit during the war. Maybe a refugee ship. Maybe something worse. And his mother. She was either lost, hiding, or... No, Dax didn't let his mind finish that thought. Later that evening, something strange happened. While checking the scanner logs, Dax noticed a pattern. A faint energy reading had appeared on the system last week. It was weak, hard to track, but it seemed to come from the hills, close to the area Riku had drawn in his picture. It repeated every 2 days, like a signal, a call for help. Dax felt his pulse quicken. He looked over at Riku, who was playing with a broken tool, poking it like it was a toy. Is your mother still out there? Dax whispered. He didn't know, but he had to find out. That night, as the stars came out and the wind howled through the vents, Dax stood at the bunker's exit door. He looked out at the dark hills in the distance. Somewhere out there, someone might be waiting. And for the first time in weeks, Dax didn't feel so alone. Because now he had a reason to leave the bunker. Not for orders, not for duty, but for Riku. The cold wind blew across the dry plains of Tarsus 9, rustling the remains of broken machines and war-damaged structures. The sky was gray with ash, and the air carried the silence of a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. Inside the bunker, the lights flickered once, then steadied again. Dax Monroe sat at the central console, eyes focused on the faint blinking dot on the screen. He had been staring at it for over an hour, watching it appear and vanish, then reappear. The signal was weak, barely there. It pulsed every couple of minutes. Not random. It had rhythm, purpose. Dax leaned closer, his jaw tight. It was coming from the same direction Riku had drawn on the dusty floor, a cave in the hills beyond the canyon line. That couldn't be a coincidence. Behind him, Riku sat on the floor, wrapping wires around his fingers like toys. He didn't talk much, but sometimes he hummed in a soft voice, like a lullaby only he remembered. It was both sweet and sad. Dax looked over his shoulder. The boy glanced up, met his eyes, then looked away. He was calmer now, no longer afraid. He trusted Dax, or at least he didn't fear him anymore. But there were still shadows in his eyes. Dax turned back to the console. He knew what he had to do. Gear up, go out there, and find the source of the signal. Maybe it was just leftover tech. Maybe it was a broken ship sending an old beacon. Or maybe Riku's mother was still alive. Dax stood and crossed the room to grab his field bag. He packed light, just enough water, some food, a weapon, and a scanner. He didn't want to scare the boy, but he also didn't want to go unprepared. Tarsus 9 had secrets buried under its soil. Riku, he said softly. The boy looked up. Dax knelt beside him. I need to go out for a while. I think I know where she is. Riku stared at him. He didn't speak, but his eyes widened slightly. Dax pointed toward the hills in the distance through the small window. Then he pointed to the drawing Riku had made days ago. The one with the woman. The cave. The boy nodded. But as Dax stood and moved toward the door, a warning alarm buzzed suddenly from the console. A message appeared across the screen in red text. High Command Priority Transmission. Level to Security AALRT. Dax frowned and moved back to read it. The message was short, but it made his stomach twist. Satellite scan detected potential alien movement within Sector 4G. All personnel are ordered to report life-form sightings immediately. If confirmed Zarnak presence is located, standard elimination protocol is in effect. No exceptions. He cursed under his breath. That was his sector. His bunker. They were talking about Riku. He shut off the message quickly before the boy could see it. His hands trembled slightly as he walked away from the console. This changed everything. If Command found out, they'd come. And they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't care that Riku was just a child. They would follow orders, eliminate threats, burn the ground if needed. Dax paced for a few seconds, trying to calm his thoughts. He couldn't let that happen. He turned to Riku and walked over, kneeling again. "We have to move soon," he whispered. "You understand." Riku tilted his head. His face was still, but his fingers pulled at the wires in his lap more nervously now. Dax grabbed a second bag and stuffed it with extra supplies. Then he did something he never imagined himself doing. He removed the tracking chip from his collar and smashed it under his boot. There would be no backup, no rescue. From now on, they were alone. Just as Dax opened the bunker hatch to step out into the gray desert, a gust of wind blew past them, and something else followed. A sound. Low. Distant. Like a growl. He froze. Riku tensed too. He backed away from the door and hid behind a storage unit, eyes wide. Dax scanned the horizon. The wind was heavy, carrying sand across the rocky surface. Nothing moved. But that sound hadn't come from the wind. It had come from something alive. Dax stepped outside slowly, rifle in hand. He moved to higher ground beside the bunker and knelt, using his scope to scan the hills. There, just for a second, he saw it. A shadow. Tall. Not human. Not Zarnak either. Something else. It disappeared behind the rocks. Dax's skin crawled. He returned quickly and sealed the hatch behind him. There was no time to waste. "Change of plan," he said to the boy, who peeked from behind the crates. "We're leaving now." Riku stood, clutching his drawing. He didn't speak, but he walked to Dax and held out the paper with the cave drawn on it. Dax took it gently. "Let's go find her," he whispered. Outside, the world waited in silence. But something else was waiting too, and it wasn't friendly. The sun had already begun to fade behind the jagged hills of Tarsus 9 when Dax Monroe and the alien child, Riku, stepped away from the shelter of the bunker. The wind carried dust and grit through the open plains, making the air dry and sharp. It was hard to breathe, even harder to think. But Dax didn't slow down. He kept moving, one hand on his bag and the other close to his rifle. Riku followed close behind him. Smaller steps, thinner legs. He didn't speak, but he didn't cry either. He kept his glowing blue eyes locked on the distant hills where, somewhere in the shadows, his mother might still be alive. The journey was hard. They walked through dried riverbeds and climbed over broken metal debris left behind from the war. The silence of the planet pressed down on them like weight. Even when they spoke, their voices sounded small, like they didn't belong here. As they reached the canyon edge, Dax stopped to check his scanner. A faint signal blinked on the screen. Same as before, soft, steady, almost like a heartbeat. He looked at the horizon, then pointed to a dark line at the base of the hill. "That must be the cave," he said quietly. Riku looked in the same direction. His face didn't change, but he stepped a little faster now. His small hands balled into fists at his side. They climbed the hill slowly. The ground was loose and sharp, the rocks shifting under their boots. Twice Dax reached back to steady Riku, afraid the boy might fall. Each time, Riku brushed it off and kept moving. Dax couldn't help but admire him. This child, weak, small, and all alone, was still pushing forward like a soldier. They reached the top just as the light began to die. The cave was there, tucked into the side of the hill. It was half covered by rubble and twisted metal, as if something had crashed into it years ago. Dax drew his weapon and stepped inside first. The cave was quiet, cold. The air smelled faintly of ash and something older, something like old blood and burned wires. He turned on his light and aimed it ahead, sweeping the beam across the walls. Shapes flickered in the shadows. Old scraps of clothing, shards of broken tech, a melted comm device. This place had once been a shelter, maybe a hiding place, maybe a last stand. Then he heard it. A soft sound, not a whisper, not a word, a breath. He turned sharply, the light falling on a figure lying against the far wall. Dax stepped closer slowly. Riku stood behind him, trembling. She was there. An alien woman, skin like Riku's, but paler now, almost gray. Her body was covered in bruises and burns. Her clothes were torn and stiff with dried blood. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythm. She was alive, but barely. Riku ran forward without fear. He dropped to his knees beside her, placing both hands on her arm. Her eyes fluttered open at the touch. And then, in the dim light, her lips moved. Riku. Dax's heart nearly stopped. It was the softest sound, full of pain, love, and relief. Her voice was cracked and dry, but she reached up with trembling fingers to touch the boy's face. Tears spilled down Riku's cheeks. He leaned into her, pressing his face against her shoulder. His small frame shook with sobs, and the sound echoed off the cave walls like a song of grief and joy at the same time. Dax stood still, rifle lowered. He felt like an intruder in something sacred. After a moment, the mother opened her eyes wider. They fixed on Dax. Her expression tightened. She tried to sit up but failed. Pain shot through her chest, and her hand dropped. "It's okay," Dax said gently, kneeling down. "I'm here to help." She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. She looked at Riku again, then back at Dax. Then she whispered something in her own language. It was weak, but filled with meaning. Riku responded softly, holding her hand. The mother stared at Dax again. This time, her eyes were softer. Dax opened his bag and pulled out water and medical gel. He gently offered both, showing her how to drink. She took tiny sips, barely enough to wet her throat. Her breath slowed, her eyes closed. Riku sat beside her, refusing to let go. Dax leaned back and looked around the cave again. And that's when he saw it. At the back of the cave, scratched into the wall with what looked like a piece of metal, were words. Not alien language, English. Heal P.U.S. Dax stepped closer. Beneath those words, in smaller letters, someone had carved numbers. A date, a time, a warning. The date was from 3 months ago. That didn't make sense. The war had ended 6 months earlier. He scanned the cave again, more carefully this time. Then he saw the footprints. Not Riku's. Not the mother's. Large ones, deep, fresh. He turned to the mouth of the cave, listening. Nothing. But something had been here. Something big. Something watching. Dax returned to the others and sat quietly beside them, hand on his weapon. The cave no longer felt safe. As night fell completely, the wind outside picked up. Dust and shadows danced across the entrance. Riku lay curled beside his mother. Her breath was slow, steady, but too weak. Dax didn't sleep. His mind kept going back to the footprints, the scratched warning, the feeling he had when they entered the cave that they weren't the first to find it. And maybe they weren't alone even now. In the distance, beyond the hills, a low sound echoed again. Not a growl this time. A howl, long and hungry. Dax tightened his grip on his rifle. This planet had been silent for too long, and now something had woken up. The night dragged on slowly, and the shadows inside the cave stretched longer with each passing hour. The small fire Dax had built at the entrance flickered with a tired glow. Sparks rose into the cold air, only to vanish just before they reached the stone ceiling. The warmth didn't do much to chase away the chill, or the fear that had crept into Dax's bones. He sat cross-legged near the fire, rifle across his lap, eyes wide open. He hadn't blinked much. Every few minutes, his gaze flicked toward the entrance, then back toward the alien woman and her child. Riku lay asleep, curled against his mother's side. The woman hadn't moved in hours. Her breathing was faint now, barely there. Dax had given her water and medicine, but it wasn't enough. Not for the kind of wound she carried. She was dying. Dax knew it, and somewhere inside, so did she. But it wasn't just the slow fading of her life that kept him on edge. It was the tracks, the sound he'd heard, the silence that now felt too quiet. Something was out there. Something watching. He felt it. He reached for the scanner again, trying to pick up any heat signature or life form nearby. The screen flickered, then buzzed with static. A brief flash appeared, movement at the edge of the scan zone. Then nothing. Dax narrowed his eyes. He turned to the cave entrance, where the fire had dimmed again. He stood and placed a few more sticks into the flames. As they caught, the light spread across the stones, casting shadows on the walls. The warmth pushed back against the cold, but only a little. That's when he heard it. Not from outside. From deep within the cave. A slow scrape. Stone on stone. Dax spun around, his rifle already raised. Nothing there. He stepped forward carefully, scanning the walls. The cave went deeper than he thought. Farther back, the darkness swallowed even the strongest beam of light. Another sound. A faint growl. Wet. Animal-like. He moved forward, inch by inch. Behind him, Riku stirred in his sleep, a soft whimper escaping his lips. Dax looked back, just for a second, to make sure the boy was okay. When he turned again, something moved in the dark. Fast. Silent. He barely saw it, just the shimmer of light on a strange shape. Then it was gone again. Dax raised his rifle and took a step back. "Who's there?" He called into the dark. His voice bounced off the stone. No answer. Then the mother's voice, so weak it was barely a whisper, called out from behind him. Dax turned and rushed back. She was awake. Barely. Her eyes were heavy, her skin even paler than before. Her hand reached out slowly toward Dax. She spoke a few words in her language, pointing toward the back of the cave. Dax shook his head. "I don't understand." Riku had woken too. He crawled to her side and held her hand tightly. Tears filled his eyes again. She looked at Dax with pain in her eyes. Then, slowly, she reached into her chest pocket and pulled out a small object, a stone. It glowed faintly. She pressed it into Dax's hand, closing his fingers around it. He looked at her, confused. She pointed at Riku, then at the stone. Then she said one word, not in her language, but in Dax. "Protect." Dax froze. She knew that word. He looked at her again. "You want me to protect him?" She nodded weakly. Then her head dropped against the wall. Dax felt like the air had been punched from his chest. Riku began to cry silently. Dax knelt beside him and held his shoulder. He didn't know what to say. He just stayed there, kneeling in that cave, one hand on the child, the other holding the glowing stone, the last gift from a dying mother. Minutes passed. The fire dimmed again. Then a scream tore through the silence. Not human, not alien, something else. It echoed from the back of the cave. Deep, hollow, hungry. Riku gasped and clutched Dax's arm. Dax stood and raised his rifle, his heart pounding. A shape moved in the shadows. Then another. And another. Dax backed up until his shoulders hit the wall. He positioned himself in front of Riku, weapon aimed at the dark. And finally, from the shadows, it stepped forward. The creature was tall, at least 8 feet. Its body hunched, covered in pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its arms were long and ended in claws that scraped the floor as it walked. Its face had no eyes, only a wide mouth full of teeth and slits for nostrils. It hissed. Dax fired. The bolt struck its shoulder, but it barely flinched. It charged. Dax fired again, twice, aiming for the chest. Sparks flew as the creature screamed in pain. Behind him, Riku shouted something in his own language. The creature slowed. Dax looked back. The glowing stone in his hand was pulsing brighter now. The creature paused, its head tilted as if sensing the energy. Dax held the stone up. The creature snarled, but didn't come closer. Then, slowly, it backed into the shadows and vanished. The cave fell silent again. Dax lowered his weapon slowly, breathing hard. Riku was still clutching his leg. He knelt again, holding the boy close. "It's okay," he whispered. "I've got you. I promise." But in his heart, he knew they weren't safe yet. This cave was a grave. And the war wasn't over, not for them. The next move would have to be his. He had to get Riku off this planet. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop. And the only thing standing between that child and death was him. The wind screamed across the surface of Tarsus 9, and dust flew like knives across the open sky. As the sun began to rise behind a curtain of ash and sand, the desert world prepared for another storm, one bigger, louder, and more dangerous than anything Dax Monroe had seen since his arrival. Inside the cave, the air had grown colder. The fire was nearly out, and the stone walls no longer held any warmth. Dax sat in silence, one hand gripping his rifle, the other holding the glowing stone the alien mother had given him. It pulsed faintly in his palm, a soft rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Riku lay against his chest, too tired to cry anymore. The child's face was stained with tears, dirt, and the kind of sadness no child should ever carry. His mother's body lay nearby, still and quiet beneath a blanket Dax had draped over her. There had been no time for a real burial. No time for words. Only a whisper, a promise. Protect him. Dax tightened his grip on the stone. He looked toward the back of the cave where the creature had vanished hours before. There had been no more sounds since then, no movement, but the fear still hung in the air like smoke. It was only a matter of time. They had to leave. Now. Dax stood carefully, lifting Riku into his arms. The boy didn't resist. He clung to Dax's jacket like a life raft, too tired to speak. Dax stepped outside the cave and immediately squinted against the wind. The sky had turned orange and brown. Dust storms on Tarsus 9 could rip skin from bone and bury machines in minutes. He didn't have long. He adjusted his gear and began walking. Each step was heavy. The sandstorm hit harder with every second, pushing against his legs, forcing him to bend low and shield Riku with his own body. The boy buried his face in Dax's shoulder, trembling. They had to reach the shuttle. It was their only chance. Dax had seen the wreckage weeks ago during a supply scan. A broken scout ship half buried beneath the sand near the canyon edge. It wasn't marked in the maps. Maybe it was Zarnak tech. Maybe human. He didn't care. If there was anything left inside that could fly or transmit a signal, they had to reach it. He moved fast, pushing through the storm, trying to keep his eyes on the old coordinates. The wind howled louder, and sand whipped against his face, drawing blood. His visor cracked slightly, letting dust in. He coughed hard, once, twice, but didn't stop. Time slipped by. He couldn't think, only move. Keep going. One more step. Then, through the storm, a shape appeared. a dark curve rising from the earth, like the back of a metal beast. The shuttle. Half its body was buried under dunes, its hatch barely visible. Dax rushed forward, nearly falling as his boots slipped on the loose sand. He reached the hatch and set Riku down carefully, then pulled the panel open. It didn't move. Locked. He slammed his fist against it, then wiped the screen beside the door. To his surprise, a faint glow appeared, a green blinking light. Still powered. He pulled the glowing stone from his pocket. It pulsed again. Dax looked at the screen, then at the stone. Could it be a key? He pressed the stone against the panel. The screen flickered once, then turned blue. The hatch hissed open. Dax didn't stop to ask how. He scooped up Riku and pushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The wind outside roared louder now, as if angry they had escaped its grip. Inside, the ship was dark, but the air was breathable. The systems were old, but not dead. Dax set Riku down in a corner and started searching the control panel. The layout wasn't familiar, not standard human tech. It was sleeker, older, maybe hybrid. But he could work with it. The ship still had power. Not much, but enough. He pulled up the main display. The map loaded slowly. Coordinates flashed. Engines offline. Communications damaged. Still, there was one good sign. An emergency beacon. It could send a signal. A strong one. Dax activated it, locking in a distress code with his old military ID. It wouldn't tell command about Riku, just that a human needed rescue. He looked over at the boy. Riku had curled into a seat, hugging his knees, eyes half closed. Dax walked over and knelt in front of him. "Hey," he said softly. "We made it." Riku looked up. His face was still, but his eyes held something new. Trust. Dax smiled, just a little. "We're gonna get out of here, I promise." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the roof. Then another. Dax stood instantly, grabbing his rifle. Something had followed them. Something heavy. It landed outside the hatch. Claws scraped against the metal. Dax turned off the lights inside and stood by the door, breathing quietly. Riku didn't scream. He just closed his eyes and stayed still, as if he knew what was out there. As if he'd seen it before. The creature outside let out a low growl. Then silence. For 5 long minutes, nothing moved. Then the noise faded. The creature had left. Dax exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. Outside, the storm began to calm. The sky faded from orange to dull gray. He walked back to the controls and watched the beacon pulse on the screen. Someone would come. It might take hours. Maybe more. But they weren't alone anymore. Dax sat beside Riku and leaned against the wall, his body sore, his heart heavy, but his mind clear. He had broken orders. He had given up safety. He had buried a stranger. But he had saved a child. And somehow, that mattered more than anything else. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. Because even on this dead, broken planet, life still had meaning. The days that followed blurred together like a fading dream. Dax Monroe stayed inside the broken shuttle, waiting for the beacon to be answered. He rationed food and water carefully, shared every drop and every bite with the child who now rarely left his side. Riku didn't speak much, not in words, but he no longer looked afraid. He would reach for Dax's hand at night, fall asleep beside him during the cold winds, and look up at him with quiet trust whenever the wind howled too loud. Outside, the desert slowly calmed. The creature never returned. Perhaps the storm had driven it deeper underground, or maybe the glowing stone had warned it away. Dax didn't know. He didn't care. All that mattered now was Riku. Keeping him alive. Keeping him safe. That was the promise he had made. And Dax Monroe was not a man who broke promises. On the 4th day, the skies changed. The horizon lit up with a shimmer of blue light. Artificial. Controlled. A search drone came first, flying low across the dunes. Then came the ship. Big, loud, human. Rescue. Dax stood at the hatch, holding Riku's hand as the shuttle descended. The moment the dust settled and the rescue team stepped out in full armor, Dax raised one hand. "I'm human," he called. "I sent the beacon." The soldiers aimed their rifles. Their helmets turned toward Riku. Dax didn't flinch. "He's with me," he said, voice firm. "He's not a threat. He's under my protection." There was a long pause. Then one of the soldiers lowered his weapon. "Orders." Dax nodded slowly. "You can report me later." The soldier didn't argue. He just gave a short nod. "Get the kid aboard." The ride back to the orbit station was quiet. Riku held tightly to Dax's sleeve and didn't look at the others. No one spoke to him. No one dared. The human soldier who had walked off-grid, broken rules, and survived alone on Tarsus 9 now sat with a child from the enemy species in his lap. No one wanted to ask questions. Not yet. They reached the medical bay. Riku was scanned, treated, and wrapped in soft blankets. Dax stood beside him the whole time. He refused to leave. Not for food. Not for rest. Not even for questioning. Eventually, the medics stopped asking. Dax filled out the reports later. Most of the truth. Not all. Some parts he kept for himself, like the last word the mother had spoken. And the glowing stone he still carried in his pocket. He never let it go. He told the command what mattered. The war was over. The child was alone. The planet was not empty. And sometimes, enemies are just people who need help. No one had the courage to challenge him. The system processed Riku's existence carefully, too carefully. There were meetings, papers, reviews. Dax attended them all. He stood tall in every room, stared down every officer, and never once let go of Riku's hand. And finally, they gave in. Riku was registered under emergency humanitarian protection. And Dax Monroe was granted full guardianship. 2 months later, they were given a small apartment on New Earth, far from war zones, far from cold deserts, and far from fear. The city was bright and full of noise. Riku didn't like the noise at first. He would hide in corners and flinch when doors slammed. But slowly things changed. He began to learn words. He began to laugh. He painted on the walls, cooked with Dax in the small kitchen, and watched the stars at night through the window. He still didn't say much, but he smiled more. And when he did, Dax swore it lit up the room. Years passed. Riku grew stronger, taller. His skin turned a richer blue. His eyes still glowed, but now with curiosity instead of fear. He went to school, made friends, and built small machines out of scrap parts just to see how they worked. And every night, he would sit with Dax and ask for a story. Sometimes about Earth, sometimes about the stars, but most often, "Tell me about my mother." Dax would nod, take a deep breath, and begin. He never left out the hard parts. He never pretended the world was soft. But he always ended with one truth. She was brave. She gave everything for you, and she made me promise something important. Riku would nod, eyes bright. "I know," he'd whisper. "You promised to protect me." Dax would ruffle his hair. Still do. One quiet night, many years later, when Riku was nearly grown, he came to Dax holding something in his hand. It was the stone, the one his mother had given. "I think it still works," he said softly. Dax raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Riku placed it on the table. It pulsed, then glowed. And then, from the stone, a tiny hologram flickered to life. A face appeared. Her face. Riku's mother. Not in pain. Not hurt. But smiling. Peaceful. The message was short. Her voice was soft, full of love. "If you see this, it means you saved him. Thank you. He is the last of us. Protect him, not because he is alien, not because he is yours, but because he is a child. And he is good. Dax's throat tightened. His hands trembled. He looked at Riku, and Riku looked back. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. That night, they sat by the window together, staring at the stars. A man and the boy who once stole his food. A soldier and a child who became his family. Not by blood, not by war, but by choice. And in a galaxy filled with destruction, monsters, and forgotten places. That choice changed everything. Forever.